Hello to everyone. Hello to so many of you. I think I'm going to start by sharing my screen today. I know many of you received documents ahead of time, but I like to share my screen. I think it's a little bit helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay. I just have to move around a couple of things. Great. Okay, so, oops, let me just go back to the first slide. Okay, so as usual at the beginning of the session, I want to invite you, if you don't have a chance to ask your question on the call, and I don't look at the chat box while we are on the call, or it would be way too distracting. So if you don't have the opportunity to reflect aloud on something or to ask a question, I invite you to email me. As Julie said, I'm really excited to be teaching in June on biblical women. We will be exploring the characters of Tamar and Devorah, and I don't think I've chosen the third character yet. Tamar, there's an echo to the story of Tamar and Judah at the end of the Book of Ruth, and we'll talk briefly about that today as an invitation to not only in the context of the Book of Ruth itself, but as an invitation to the Thursday, June class about biblical foremothers, what I'm calling biblical foremothers. So I will recap a little bit from chapters 1 and 2, and then transition us into, I think, what are very different chapters and difficult chapters for several reasons, one of which I've mentioned a few times, that there are a number of legalities, there are a number of legal structures that as readers, we're expected to completely understand exactly what the text is talking about in its intertextual and its references to other parts of the Hebrew Bible. The text assumes we know exactly what it's talking about. So I will present in front of you today a couple of texts to help get into your own minds the exact reference of what the author probably intended us to know. So we've talked about how chesed can be both an act of self-chesed, a simultaneously act of what I like to call self-chesed, and other chesed. Meaning, in the first chapter, Ruth may have been, we don't know for sure, but her character may have been looking out for her own best interest and deciding not to go back to the land of Moab to her family, and instead to go back to Judea with her mother-in-law Naomi. And there may have even been hints that Naomi didn't want her to go, but Ruth went anyway, and one might say that she just did the right thing. She looked out for Naomi's best interest, but one might argue also that she was looking out for her own best interest, but also prioritizing the relationship. So there are several layers there. And just so you take a moment to have in front of you, this is the what I would say is the core verse, the most famous verses probably of the chapter. Verse 17 that follows says, basically, till death do us part, I will be buried with you as well. And I'm not going to summarize the plot right now, but in chapter 2, we see that Ruth decides, after it sounds like they settle in a little bit to the land of Judea, and they're welcomed back by sort of a chorus of women. Ruth decides to go to the fields to glean and provide for herself and her mother-in-law. And she happens upon, right, there's really no such thing as a coincidence in the Book of Ruth. She happens upon the field of someone who could potentially help them. His name is Boaz, and he's a relative of Naomi's husband who has passed away, named Elimelech. And Boaz says to her, "You've inspired me. I've heard everything that you did for your mother-in-law." And he, in multiple ways, takes care of her and makes sure that she's taken care of as she gleans during her day, and invites her for food and sends her home with a lot of food. So we talked a little bit also about how maybe Boaz, we don't know exactly what his motivations were, but simultaneously he was extremely generous with her, and also perhaps thinking, maybe this woman, I'm interested in this woman. And I recall someone, I think her name might have been Judy, but I can't say for sure. Someone shared a comment that, maybe Ruth, even though the text does actually not, interestingly, does not say this was an attractive young woman. Maybe Ruth was an attractive young woman. And as the text actually says, she is someone who inspires him. So we see that chesed is contagious. Ruth began, the character of Ruth begins in the first chapter and precipitates a number of chesed actions that follow, including the first one that we see here in chapter 2 with Boaz. Okay, so what I want to shift to now is, we talked also a little bit about yibum, levirate marriage, but I want to talk a little bit more about that now. And also we talked about this legality of the redemption of land. So I want to look at a couple of those texts, and I know we did look before, but I think they're particularly relevant to chapters 3 and 4. When we talked about how Maimonides expressed the idea that there are two kinds of chesed, two kinds of acts of love and kindness. One is that when we behave righteously towards someone that we have no obligation toward, and another is that we behave beyond the letter of the law towards someone. Maimonides says that in our inspired writings in the Hebrew Bible, that kindness is primarily the first term, going above and beyond what the letter of the law obligates us to in a relationship. Okay, so I want to just I'll invite you to keep in mind Maimonides' definition of acts of love and kindness as we go through chapters 3 and 4. So I'm just moving the window a little bit so I can see the text. So in Leviticus 25, there is a law that if someone is in such dire straits, a man typically who owns his land, if he's in dire straits and he has to sell part of his land outside his tribe, eventually someone in his own clan should come and redeem that land, should buy it back from the person to whom he sold it, so that the land stays in the family. That's the goal of redemption of the land. There's no marriage involved in this. In this geula, as we call it in Hebrew, in this redemption of land, there's only this idea that a land should stay in the hands of a particular family. And also, I'm gonna skip that. Oh goodness, oh no. Okay, I apologize. I don't know, I'm skipped a slide by accident. It could be that I deleted. So I will just tell you about it. No, oh no, I didn't, it's right here, okay. So also something you may be familiar with either from our earlier sessions together or from previous learning is that if a woman and her husband don't have children and the husband dies, in order for the husband's name to be perpetuated, to continue in his clan, the brother of the husband is obligated to marry the widow so that if they have a son, the woman's son, this couple's son is actually considered the son of the past husband, not the new husband. In addition, this certainly protects a widow because widows, as you likely know from other areas of the Bible often talks about protecting a widow and protecting an orphan and protecting a stranger, many of which actually apply to the Book of Ruth. So this also protects the widow in the sense that typically if a woman's husband died, she would go back to her, it seems like, we don't know very much about it, but it seems like she would go back to her father's house. But in this case, she could stay within the clan, within the family, without too much disruption, as we might look at it today, if she married her husband's brother. And the rabbis limit these laws even more. They say it has to be a brother from the same father. It has to be It has to be a brother who's living at the time that the husband dies. So there are a number of additional limitations in later rabbinic literature. But what I want to keep in mind is that Yibum is like an open public ceremony. It's, as well as we're not going to talk about so much here, but this is a process that happened openly. It's only for the brother, and again, it keeps the land in the family and perpetuates the past father, husband's name, but also protects the widow. Okay, so what I'd like to do now, and I'm going to stop the screen share. Now I can see so many of you. What I'd like to do now is with you read some of chapter 3 and analyze it a little bit together. And actually, I want to go back to my slides for just a moment. Oops, I'm sorry, I just accidentally opened iTunes. So we're not going to listen to music on this call, but I invite you to listen to music whenever you like. So let me share my screen one more time. And I almost forgot that I wanted you to look at, and let me just make sure I see here. And again, oh, here we go. Okay. So what I want us to look at is, as we read chapters 3 and 4, is there also what I'm calling the self-other duality or dialectic? Is there still what I've suggested is in chapters 1 and 2, which is that someone can simultaneously do good for themselves and do good for them others? And of course, I'll say conversely, if we're behaving badly towards someone, we're actually behaving badly toward ourselves. And I'm sure this is something many of us have thought about when we make errors with our friends and loved ones. So, so that's one question. Is that dialectic, is that duality in place in chapters 3 and 4? From what we know, and you can probably guess based on how I've presented the material already, from what we know about Yibum, levirate marriage, and land redemption, are these legal structures, in fact, being expressed in chapter 3 and chapter 4 of the Book of Ruth, as people often think? And if so, and even if not, since there are resonances of those legal structures, the text, I think, clearly wants us to be thinking about these legal structures. How does that impact our ideas of chesed? Whoops. And I have to move my window here. Are there other messages about chesed? And I wrote in green there that it's an added question because I added it after I sent my document to Julie this morning. So I'll remind you of all those questions as we move along, but that's what I want us to take a moment to think about. So actually, before we read the text, I want to pause just for one reflection or one question to invite one of your voices into our, what I'd like to think of as a conversation, even though there are so many of us. So I'm going to pause for just a moment. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if I can do that, and see if anyone would like to share a reflection or question on the material.
And you can put that in the chat, or you can chat to me that you'd like to be unmuted. Okay, great. Rosa, you are unmuted.
Okay. So I was wondering, what'll happen if there was an issue, if there was a daughter born in the first marriage? Does a levirate marriage still have to take place?
That's a great question. I believe not, because daughters could inherit if there were no sons. It's a great question. You may be familiar with the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. Yes. So daughters can inherit when there are no sons. Great question. Okay, of course, I'm tempted to take more, but we're gonna keep shifting, and thank you, Rosa, for posing a question and sharing your voice with the group. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen again, and let's go back here. And I am gonna get out of the slides and shift to chapter 3. And I will invite, you can see there's a lot of material in here that we're not gonna cover today, but we are gonna focus on verses 1 through 14, actually 1 through 15, I believe. So I would like to invite 2 readers, one for verses 1 through 7, and then we'll have another voice for verses 8 through 14. So may I invite 2 readers?
Jody, you're unmuted.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jody. So 1 through 8 are yours.
Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "Daughter, I will seek rest, a home for you, and that will be good for you. Now there is our kinsman Boaz, whose girls you were close to. He will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor tonight. So bathe, anoint yourself, dress up, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not disclose yourself to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he lies down, and go and uncover his feet. Lie down. He will tell you what you are to do." She replied, "I will do everything you tell me." She went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. Boaz ate and drank, and in a cheerful mood went to lie down beside the grain pile. Then she went over stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night, the man gave a start and pulled back. There was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked.
Go ahead, Jody. Go ahead.
"Who are you?" he asked. And she replied, "I am your handmaid Ruth. Spread your robe over your handmaid, for you are a redeeming kinsman."
Okay, I want to pause there for a moment, and then Jody, well, I'll invite you to continue to read because it can get a little confusing on Zoom with a lot of people reading. So I want to point out, in case you hadn't noticed before in the Book of Ruth, something I love to point out, and I love about this book, is Ruth's assertiveness and her take the bull by the horns demeanor. So you may notice that in blue here, I'm a big fan of color coding. Oops. Naomi tells Ruth, listen, this is what you should do. Uncover his feet, lay down, and wait, right? Be a proper lady, wait. And Ruth says, of course, Naomi, mom, whatever she calls her, I will do everything you tell me. So verse 6 says, okay, she did just as her mother-in-law instructed her. Verse 7 says she uncovers his feet, she lays down, but then she doesn't wait for him. Oh, well, he wakes up, but then she says, spread your robe over your handmaid. You have a job to do. You're a redeeming kinsman. You have land to redeem. You have people to protect. It's interesting to think about, and we haven't talked about this so much, but I would be remiss, and I think it's so important to emphasize also that this is such a female-centered story, and you know, I have mentioned it is so rare in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, to find a woman who is strong and assertive in the same ways that Ruth is. I find her such an inspiration, and I was going to say something also, but it escaped me a bit. But I wanted to share with you also, and I put down below here, which I definitely want to show you. In the Jewish Study Bible, there is a comment on, and I put the page here in case you want to look that up. I know I've mentioned the book as it's really a go-to commentary for me. It's the whole Hebrew Bible with a bunch of essays and running commentary and outlines on the side that is very helpful in reading any book in the Tanakh. Spreading his robe over her asks her, Jewish Study Bible says it indicates it's a symbol of him protecting, being the redeeming kinsman. And in fact, it also echoes back what Boaz said to her, may you seek shelter from God. May God provide shelter for you. Boaz says that in chapter 12. And I have so many thoughts to share with you at one time. Something also to think about during, as we finish our study of the Book of Ruth today, is that God's name was invoked twice as a request for chesed, or as someone who, as an entity that provides chesed. But in fact, in this story, it's the humans who are constantly on their own chesed journeys. So it's really a powerful message that it's one thing to invoke God's name as God who provides chesed, but it's another thing for humans to actually take action in order to make that happen. However, it also says Ruth words are also a marriage proposal. And in fact, this beautiful but somewhat disturbing text in Ezekiel is also a reference to marriage, God's marriage to the Israelites. The texts above the verses above sort of talk about how God pursues and courts and then takes care, goes into a covenant, or here we have the covenant that begins here with the Israelites, but I'm going to just go ahead and read this out loud. I think it's worth making the connection here. When I passed by you again and saw that your time for love had arrived, this is God speaking to the Israelites, so I spread my robe over you and I covered your nakedness and I entered into a covenant with you by oath, declares the Lord. Thus you became mine. Really a powerful poetry. And in fact, that's exactly Ruth is saying to him, you're a redeemer and also you should marry me. So let me pause there for a moment. And I am going to invite a comment or reflection. What do you think is happening here from a legal perspective? Is she suggesting yibum? Is she suggesting some form of levirate marriage? Or thinking back to the texts at the very beginning, is she suggesting land redemption? So I just want to I will invite just one in the interest of time. I will invite just one comment to respond to that, and then I will share my thoughts.
Jody, you're unmuted.
Jody? Oh, excuse me. I hadn't raised my hand to comment, but I will. I wonder, I'm not a long-standing student in this area, but I wonder whether Boaz was initially determined to be a redeeming kinsman because of his relation to Elimelech rather than Malone. I wonder about Naomi being past her prime.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that directly answers your questions.
No, you're thinking out loud. Yeah.
Those are some of the things that come to mind when I look at this.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are factors, and what would help you think about is this levirate. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, and back up before you referenced to some discussion about Ruth's beauty.
Oh,
I think that was me talking about how beautiful she was. That I've read quite a bit about that, but that my theory is that beauty helped her develop her self-confidence and her self-esteem, so that she was often in a place where she was over the top with her chesed. I think that Boaz knew that. And then lastly, I'll say this: when we get farther down the line with regard to the closer redeeming kinsman, I didn't know that her language was a proposal for marriage, but it occurred to me that Boaz may have added in that condition when he announced he was offering the land to a closer redeeming kinsman, and that kinsman, after Ruth had spent the night with Boaz, was no longer willing to take on that additional burden of marrying Ruth because she had been with Boaz, perhaps, or it was rumored. So
okay. So Jody, thank you. I think this is a good opportunity to share with the group. I think this is a good moment. We haven't really used the terms I'm about to use, which is the distinction between pshat and drash. The distinction between a contextual reading of the text, meaning understanding what's going on in the text from its context, its narrative context, its ancient Near Eastern context, reading out from the text, which is formerly called, not formerly, but formally, that's the word I'm thinking of, formally called exegesis, reading out. And pshat is often translated as simple. It is, as one of my teachers, who I always like to quote because she's so wonderful. Her name is Malka Strasberg. As she taught me, pshat is really best translated as contextual meaning. So what we're doing in analyzing Ruth together these past few sessions is a little of both. But I invite you to think about, when is it that we're doing a pshat reading and when is it that we're doing, and here's the next term, a drash reading, which is formally, academically, eisegesis, reading into the text. Reading from our own experience, from our own meaning making desire in 2020 and 2020, from our own desire to make meaning out of this ancient text, we read into the text our own meaning, which Jews have been doing for, and other cultures certainly too, Jews have been doing for a couple thousand years. And I'm going to reference the same friend and colleague and teacher, Malka, who likes to talk about what's more meaningful for Jews over time. Is it pshat or is it drash? Pshat is fascinating, and I would argue that just the intellectual exercises around pshat are very meaningful. But reading into the text and finding our own meaning for ourselves as in whatever community we're in, and also for our own selves, our own hearts and minds, finding our own meaning, I think is really just, there's nothing like it. And I guess I would agree with Malka in the end. So what Jody was doing, and Jody, I hope you don't mind my saying, what Jody is doing is making meaning with the help of rabbinic commentaries. She's reading into the text, she's drashing on the text. It is not, but I think it's important to make a distinction and be aware that in the text, fascinatingly, it doesn't say anything about Ruth's appearance, whereas with our foremothers in Genesis, it does. So I'm gonna, that was like slightly tangential, but I really wanted to address those different, what we're actually doing. I wanted to like kind of bring it to the meta level with pshat and drash. And so now I'm gonna go back to chapter 3 and kind of answer my own question, bring us back to the question, and then we'll shift to chapter 4. So screen share. Okay, so I'm just looking at some of my print notes, if you don't mind. If you'll bear with me for a second, because I definitely want to make this point clearly. Okay. So I certainly think what is going on, in my opinion, what is going on in this chapter is that we find out, and a little bit later, we're not going to finish the chapter together, but of course I invite you to do that on your own. But I'm looking for the verse where Boaz reacts to Ruth and he says to her, this is his reaction, verse 10. Oh my goodness, may you be blessed. Your chesed, your act of love and kindness is greater than your first. Meaning your first chesed was making a decision to go back with Naomi, to support your mother-in-law on her journey, to settle with her in the land of Judea. You took care of her in that way. Not only did you take care of Naomi in that way, you are going way above and beyond any expectations right now, because not only are you telling me that I should redeem the land, but you, I'm using so many pronouns, Naomi and Ruth would be more protected if, two things. One, if Boaz were to marry her, there's certainly a status issue of being married, but there's also the issue of if Ruth were to have a child and if the child were a son, that son could carry on, I don't want to misspeak, that son could then support them also when he gets older on their land. Okay, I don't want to get into too many technicalities, but it's so tempting. But what I want to say here is that Ruth, what seems to be revealed in this chapter is that Ruth's act here, at least, is quite selfless, because, and he even says to her, you know what, you're an eligible woman, you're of a marriageable age, you could have forged a relationship or perhaps an arranged marriage with another man, but instead what you're doing is allowing me, Boaz, to redeem the land for your family, for Naomi's family. And that is a chesed. So your act of letting me know what I'm supposed to do is an act of chesed because it takes care of Naomi on a whole new level. So there is a selflessness here that I don't think I'm in my experience just reading the text, I didn't really see it before until I think we don't really see it until we encounter this part here. And I would just present a distinction here between the selflessness of Ruth and her second chesed and Boaz's hesitation, which he says, oh, well, let me let you know, there is a redeeming kinsman who's a closer relative, and so we should really go with him in order to redeem the land. Now, in land redemption laws, it doesn't really matter who's the closest relative. In Yibum, in Levirate marriage, it should only be a brother. So the thing that I'm going to segue into now and then shift to chapter 4 briefly is, and I'm scrolling down to show you, this text right here, which the commentaries in general, and the classical commentaries as well, not just the modern commentaries, are pretty clear that this is not Levirate marriage. It seems like Levirate marriage, and there are echoes of it, but it's definitely not Levirate marriage. If it would be, it would have happened out in the open quickly. But instead, there's this whole strange courtship happening, and it does seem like it's Levirate marriage with a widow and her daughter-in-law. So I want to suggest that to you, and now what we're going to do is read parts of chapter 4 and then really try and bring this whole book together. So I'm going to just switch to chapter 4 here. And, again, I color-coded a few things that I wanted to highlight to you for you, and I'll read those. I'm going to kind of summarize what happens in this text and then focus on the end, which adds like 25 layers to the text. Okay, not 25, 2 or 3. So Boaz tells Ruth at the end of chapter 2, okay, I'm going to make this happen tomorrow. I'm going to commit to redemption happening either by me or by the closest relative. Boaz, who we should have gathered by now that he's an important guy with status, a guy with resources. He goes to the elders at the gate of the town, and the Redeemer happens to be passing by, right? Lots of coincidence in the book. And he tells him the situation. Boaz tells the Redeemer the situation. The Redeemer, by the way, in this text, if you didn't know before, he's called Ploni Almoni, which becomes the rabbinic way of referring to Joe Schmo. Anytime the rabbis want to talk about just like some situation with some dude, his name is Ploni Almoni. So it's a fun name. He says to the guy, listen, there's land to be redeemed because Naomi's back in town and Elimelech, as you know, has died. And so one of us has to redeem the land. Do you want it? And he says, yeah, okay, I'll take it. And then Boaz says to Ploni Almoni, well, listen, you should just know there's a couple things that come along with the land. And by a couple things, I mean Ruth, the Moabite, and Naomi, her mother-in-law, Elimelech's widow. So the Ploni Almoni is like, oh, wait a second. I didn't agree to that. I only agreed to redeeming the land, so you can go ahead and redeem it. And what he's conveying, the Ploni Almoni, this Joe Schmo guy, is saying, listen, I have my own land, probably with my own family. I'm not going to give up and sacrifice my own resources in order to do this righteous act. I'm not calling it an act of chesed because it's legalized in the Bible. And in fact, it's probably legalized because people wouldn't otherwise do it. They would look out for their own self-interest. So in order to keep land in the family, the law was likely enacted, or at least written down in the Torah, and Ploni Almoni says no thanks. So as you may know, a marriage happens, and we learn that, again, there's an echo of Yibum, that in order to establish the name of the deceased, and so his name won't be cut off, this marriage is going to happen, and Ruth is blessed. It's a very interesting text, and I included some commentary below about it. Ruth is blessed so that she should be like Rachel and Leah, the foremothers who, between the two of them and their maidservants in Genesis, gave birth to the 12 tribes of Israel and to Dinah, the one daughter of Jacob. If you have questions about that, feel free to email me. I'm not going to go into detail now. And also, may your house be like the house of Peretz. So I'm just going to spend a moment on this, but invite you to look into it after and to email me. I included a family tree all the way at the bottom of this document where you can see Peretz. It's a tzadi in the Torah. Peretz is the son of Judah and Tamar. Judah and Tamar, Judah is one of Jacob's sons in the Bible, and there's a story in Genesis 38 that I mentioned earlier that should have been, the narrative of the story should have been an echo of Yibum, of Levirate marriage, but it's Levirate marriage gone awry. And Tamar ends up dressing up as a prostitute so that she can trick Judah into sleeping with her so that she can get her due, which is a son, from Judah's first son and second son, who both passed away, who were both her husbands. And then Judah denied the third son. So that's a lot of detail. Again, like, I invite you to read Genesis 38, and you'll hear these amazing echoes between Genesis 38 and between the Book of Ruth. So Peretz was the son of an unlikely union, and his name means both breach and blossom. And so commentators say, I'm scrolling up to the top here also, back to the top, that when Ruth is given this blessing that your house should be like Peretz, the blessing is actually saying this is an unexpected union, but what in the end resulted in the line of Judah, which of course will in the end result in the line of David. So I'll come back to that in just a moment. One of the strangest things about this story, and someone actually emailed me about this, which prompted me to look into it a little bit more, is that it seems like both Naomi and Ruth become the mothers of this new baby that is Ruth's. Some commentators say, look, it's just a reversal of fortune. Chapter 4 just shows how Naomi's life completely turned around, and I would add did so because of the chesed of her daughter-in-law Ruth. But what really, a few things seem to be happening is that this is not classical Yibum. It almost seems like double Yibum to me, double Levirate marriage where Ruth acts as a surrogate for Naomi. Naomi, there's two possible sort of Yibum relationships. Naomi's husband Elimelech dies. There's a redeemer who can redeem the land, or perhaps in some way, in some Levirate marriage-like fashion, marry Naomi, but Naomi is not of childbearing years. And so Ruth acts in her place, marries the Redeemer, has this sort of Levirate marriage process happen, and the son is really both their sons, which is strange, but nevertheless results in Ruth being the great-grandmother of King David. Now, it is a strange end to the story. I want to bring us back, because we only have a few minutes, to Chesed and what this all has to do with Chesed. And then certainly I invite you to email me to read some commentaries on this, because it is quite a difficult chapter. What I'd like to suggest to you is that because what we have here is these pseudo-legalities. We have something that's similar to Levirate marriage, but not quite. Redemption of the land, but not in its classical sense. It comes with a widow and a daughter-in-law. When we think about this in the context of Chesed, I would suggest we ask ourselves, well, then what's going on here? What's the message? I would suggest that the message is actually that Chesed, as Maimonides suggested early on, is about going above and beyond the letter of the law in the context of a relationship. And so the whole book of Ruth presents to us not only this duality that, actually I would argue for several dualities, but I'll say not only a duality of Ruth, of people acting both simultaneously, taking care of themselves, self-chesed, while also taking care of the other chesed. In chapter 3, we sort of saw we were, I think, reminded that there's a continuum of chesed. Sometimes someone can be completely and utterly selfless. Sometimes someone can hesitate. Ruth, as we saw, was completely selfless. Boaz hesitated. But in chapter 4, we're reminded not only can great things come about, unexpected great things come about from a spiral of chesed, from a cycle of chesed, but chesed is certainly not happening in chapter 4 and in this book in legal contexts. It's happening above and beyond legal contexts. And if you even take the prohibition against marrying Moabite people in Deuteronomy as applying to women, which the rabbis do not, they say it only applies to men, but then Ruth would have been a prohibited marriage. It would have been prohibited for Boaz to marry Ruth. And so this text is also challenging, well, where does chesed come from? Chesed can also come from the most unlikely of sources. Maybe we would never expect chesed to come from someone who's considered part of the arch enemy tribe, the enemy tribe in distinction to the Israelites. But she does. Ruth is a Moabite, and she precipitates this whole cycle of chesed. So it is 3:45, so I know we have to end momentarily. I just want to sum up one more thing, if Julie nods that it's okay. Thank you, Julie. Okay. That, you know, I invite you to read the slides here. Oops, I'm sorry about that. And I just have to move my window here. What I suggested in the end, just so you can see it in front of you, is that generosity toward the self precipitates generosity toward others. And there's an inextricable link between the two. Perhaps that can really, and this is my drash, in 2020, when, especially in the midst of a pandemic, when we're not feeling like doing the right thing for ourselves or the right thing for others, perhaps that idea can inspire us. Well, if I'm not feeling like doing the right thing for myself, maybe I'll do the right thing for someone else, and that will precipitate a cycle of chesed that will help immerse me in a cycle of chesed. And I also suggested, for example, that, that chesed in this whole book is all about going above and beyond the letter of the law. We are tempted to think that there are legal structures in place, but they're not legal structures that are where people are acting within them. They're acting beyond them. And finally, I think we read this text on, I'm suggesting somewhat of a drash, but most of the reasons for why we read the text on Shavuot are reading into the text, that we remind ourselves that one of the essential purposes of our Torah, of our tradition, is to remind ourselves of chesed, of acts and love and kindness, and that someone who is a chesed actor is not necessarily an Israelite or a Jew, not necessarily a man, the main gender in the Torah, and that it can be modeled. Chesed can be, if we look for chesed, it can be anywhere, and perhaps even in the most unlikely of places, in someone or something we consider the other, completely separate from us. So I know that was a lot of material to go through in one session. And again, I invite you, if you have any questions or reflections, to please shoot me an email. I'll try and put it in the chat once more before we end our call, abby@explorejewish.com. And I hope that this learning experience for you enhanced or enriched your own understanding of the Book of Ruth. And I hope to see you in June, and I wish you lots of chesed in your life and lots of joy and rich learning in your